My name is Shri Kumar, and I write under the pen name K.S. Nair, primarily on the subjects of Indian military, aviation, and maritime history. In some ways, I'm a schoolboy aeroplane nerd who never grew up. I want to talk a little about Indian aviation, and in particular, Indian DFC recipients. If you look back in history, through the first half of the 20th century, the most glamorous and elite military qualification was being a military pilot. Now, this actually traces back to a deliberate PR campaign during the First World War. There was this British newspaper tycoon, enormously influential and a little controversial, something like Rupert Murdoch today. His name was Lord Northcliffe. Lord Northcliffe was named to a government position in the British government during the First World War, and he abandoned a long-standing British policy of not identifying British military personnel by name. He started a policy of identifying British military pilots who had done particularly well, who had shot down large numbers of enemy aircraft, and giving them special coverage, adulation, on a scale that a Bollywood or an IPL star might enjoy in India today. So in that process, he created this category of pilots called aces. That was never an official category. That was never an official designation. It is something that Lord Northcliffe created as a PR campaign, basically to distract the public from the grinding attrition that World War I had become. Whatever the motivation, it worked. Aces became celebrities, and a lot of the British public attention was diverted from the senior sides of what was happening in World War I. And aces enjoyed a standing that few warriors did at that time. Among those aces, there was a teenaged Indian. His name was Indra Lal Roy. He was born in Calcutta, but he went to school in the UK, to a very prestigious school called St. Paul's, more than 400 years old even at that time. And other alumni of that school include the military historian Sir Basil Liddell-Hart and the British Field Marshal Montgomery. Indra Lal Roy graduated from there, and at the age of about 17 and a half, he applied to join the Royal Flying Corps. The aviation arm of the British Armed Forces at that time was still a corps of the British Army, because the Royal Air Force had not been formed yet. Be that as it may, Indra Lal Roy was commissioned into the Royal Flying Corps in 1917 and sent out to France with less than 4 months training. His first tenure in France was with the squadron of the Royal Flying Corps, where he didn't last very long before he suffered a crash. He was knocked unconscious and taken for dead, and he was actually laid out in a morgue along with other dead bodies. He came to in the middle of the night and started banging on the locked door of the morgue, shouting for help in schoolboy French. The morgue attendant was so frightened by this apparent raising from the dead that he refused to open the door until he had backup. So Roy, from his injuries, was sent back to recuperate and spent a few months in hospital, then returned to the front in France in 1918. This time, he managed to get into action. His flight commander in the squadron that he was sent to was an Irish pilot called McElroy. And he and McElroy, Indra Lal Roy and the Irishman McElroy, combined very well in the air. Over the next 2 weeks, Indra Lal Roy achieved a string of 9 victories over enemy aircraft, and 2 of them were shared with McElroy. And there is a very famous poem by the Irish poet W.B. Yeats called "An Irish Airman Foresees His Death." It is something that Indians who participated in World War I can probably identify with very well. Indra Lal Roy had his first victory quite early in his second tour of the front. And on about his third or fourth day of combat, he actually shot down 3 German aircraft in the space of 4 hours. And one of those German aircraft was the Fokker D-7, which was such a formidable aircraft, or regarded as such a formidable aircraft by the Allies, that it was specifically named in the Armistice Agreement as something that Germany had to give up. Over that 2-week period, Roy, as I said, achieved 9 victories over German aircraft. And then about 16 days into that brilliant spell, he himself was shot down in an unequal combat with 4 Fokker D-7s. They went down in flames. He was not even 20 years old at the time. In those days, didn't issue parachutes to aircraft pilots because they were concerned that pilots might abandon their aircraft too early. So when you were shot down in flames, basically you burnt up with the aircraft, or in some cases, pilots are known to have jumped clear of the aircraft without a parachute because they preferred dying that way to being burnt up in the aircraft. World War I came to an end within a few months, and it ended even before Indra Lal Roy's 20th birthday. Indra Lal Roy is buried in a very pleasantly maintained cemetery in France. The grave is marked and well looked after. And he received the first Distinguished Flying Cross, the 3rd highest British gallantry award given specifically for gallantry in the air. And Indra Lal Roy was the first of about 25 Indians to receive the Distinguished Flying Cross, the only one in the First World War. In the early 1930s, long after Indra Lal Roy's death, the first 6 Indians to be selected for training at the Royal Air Force Academy at Cranwell came to the UK. And among those 6 was Subrata Mukherjee. Subrata Mukherjee, who would go on to become the first Indian Chief of the Indian Air Force, is a nephew of Indra Lal Roy. So in that sense, he forms a link to that first Indian DFC recipient over the skies of France in World War I, and the thousands of Indians who've become pilots since then. Military aviation in India during the period between the 2 world wars was driven largely by the Royal Air Force and by the Royal Air Force's need to find something to do. At the end of World War I, the Royal Air Force was at its peak strength of a couple of 100 squadrons. But when World War I came to an end, the British very rapidly reduced the size of all their armed forces, and in particular of their Air Force. Lord Trenchard, Marshal of the Royal Air Force, the Lord Trenchard, who is in many ways regarded as the father of the Royal Air Force, was appointed to the position of Chief of the Royal Air Force for the second time in the period between the 2 world wars. And he was very keen to ensure that during this process of downsizing, the Royal Air Force didn't lose its identity. There was a very real possibility that the Royal Air Force would have been split back into its component elements of an Army Flying Corps and a Naval Air Service, and absorbed back into the British Army and the Royal Navy. But Trenchard was determined to make sure that didn't happen, and kept looking around for work that the Air Force could do as the Air Force. One of the things he came up with, one of the tasks or roles for an independent Air Force that Trenchard came up with, was this idea of imperial air policing. He put forward a theory that policing from the air would be more effective, particularly in the more distant and unruly colonies of the empire. And he put that theory to the test in places like Somaliland, Iraq, and the northwest frontier provinces of India. So it was that the Royal Air Force started using the northwest frontier province of India as a proving ground, where they worked to make sure that their identity as an independent service was maintained and protected. Now, since they were operating in India during the period between the two world wars, it was a period when the civilian government in India was under pressure to include more Indians in government. Soon after the First World War, there had been a series of reforms in India called the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. And soon after the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, partly as a result of some of the recommendations that were made in those during those reforms, the Raj-era government of India formed a committee called the Skene Committee, headed by a British Lieutenant General, General Andrew Skene, to look into the possibility of admitting Indians as officer cadets into the three most prestigious military academies in the UK at that time: the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, the Artillery School at Woolwich, and the Royal Air Force Academy at Cranwell. This was not a proposal that went down entirely well with the British government. There was a lot of opposition, and it's possible to follow the 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of progress of these recommendations. But as it happens, the recommendation, although made in 1927, they were finally acted on around 1930-31. And the first entrance exams were held in India for the admission of Indians to Sandhurst, Woolwich, and Cranwell. And 18 young Indians passed that exam, of which 6 opted for Cranwell. So those 6 were the first officers of what were to become the Indian Air Force, although the Indian Air Force had not yet come into being. Those 6 officers went off to Cranwell and became the nucleus of the Indian Air Force, trained alongside British candidates for the Royal Air Force. Did pretty well. All of them were good sportsmen. That was part of the qualifications that were expected when they took the entrance exam for admission to British military academies. They represented Cranwell in different sports, including tennis and hockey. And in hockey, Indians were very, very good in those days. We were a dominant country in that sport. And they, by and large, distinguished themselves at Cranwell. They had been through a fairly strong filter to get to Cranwell, and they did fairly well at Cranwell. One officer from that first 6 could not be qualified to fly because he was too short. His legs weren't long enough to reach the rudder pedals. So he was accepted for a commission in the equipment branch and continued to serve in the Indian Air Force, though not as a pilot. And to replace him, a 7th Indian came out from India. That 7th Indian was a young Parsi lad called Aspi Engineer. Aspi Engineer was already something of an aviation legend because a couple of years earlier, as a 17-year-old, he had beaten 2 more experienced pilots to become the fastest Indian to fly between India and the UK in an aircraft of his own. Right? So he came from a well-off family and flew an aircraft of his own against the experienced competition of another young Parsi Indian called J.R.D. Tata and an Indian called Manmohan Singh. All 3 of them were well-off young Indians who had taken to flying as a hobby. All 3 of them would become key figures in Indian aviation history. Aspi Engineer, who was the 7th Indian to go to Cranwell, would go on to become the 2nd Indian chief of the Indian Air Force after Subrata Mukherjee, who was from the first batch. J.R.D. Tata went on to start Air India, Tata Airways and then Air India, as we all know. Manmohan Singh would go on to become among the first batch of Indian pilots to volunteer for service in the Air Force after the Second World War broke out. So we'll talk a little more about him in a few minutes. The Cranwell trained Indians and several succeeding batches over the next 6 years or so completed their training in Cranwell. All of them went on to do a postgraduate course at what was called the School of Army Flying in the UK, learning to do what was called Army Cooperation Flying. Right? And then they would all serve for a year or so with the Royal Air Force Squadron before coming back to India. They came back to India. On the 1st of April 1933, A flight of number 1 squadron of the Indian Air Force was formed. And the first 6 Indians did make it back into India. And about 15 odd Indians in the role that they called Hawaii Sepoys, the equivalent of airmen today. Right? There were also 2 British officers and several British senior NCOs to help them along this first few steps of a fledgling Air Force. The Indian Air Force took 7 years to grow from the 1 flight of 1 squadron to 1 complete squadron. Be that over those 7 years, the Indians who did manage to clear all the hurdles to get into the Air Force and join that tiny infant organization had to work harder to be trusted with the most basic tasks of an Air Force. So it was a very, very difficult period. A lot of this changed in 1939 when it became clear that the Second World War was on the horizon. Some far-seeing Britons could see that it would be necessary to bring more Indians into the Air Force, to train more Indians in the skills that were required, and to accept that Indians, if properly trained, could assume those roles. It wasn't easy, but the process did start. Around 1939, the government of India created what was called the Indian Air Force Volunteer Reserve. This was on a model that had been made popular in the UK. The Volunteer Reserve was made up of weekend flyers, generally well-off young men, who could spend their own money to learn flying up to a certain basic level, and then were absorbed into the Volunteer Reserve to learn elements of military flying and relieve professional Air Force personnel from some of the basic requirements that the Volunteer Reserve could cover. So a similar Volunteer Reserve was established in India, and it was made up of both Britons who lived in India at the time, of which there were a great many, and some well-off Indians who were happy to learn to fly. Right? So the Indian Air Force Volunteer Reserve was formed, and it made up 5 small organizations called Coast Defense Flights. These 5 Coast Defense Flights were split between the different the major coastal cities in India: Karachi, Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, and Vizag. And some years later, a 6th one was formed for Cochin. Right? And for all its limitations, the Coast Defense Flights did manage to spread the capability to operate military aircraft, even though at that time particularly old and slow military aircraft, to a number of Indian pilots and ground crew. And in 1939, when the Second World War broke out, initially it didn't make much difference to the Indian Air Force. In the first 2 years of World War II, the Soviet Union was not allied with Britain and France, and the United States had not come into the war at all. So the allies were essentially Britain and France and some other European countries. The Soviet Union actually had a non-aggression pact with Germany for the first 2 years of World War II. So in many ways, British concern about the defense of India was actually centered around seeing the Soviet Union as an enemy. And the British during that period were more concerned about the Soviet Union invading India through the Khyber Pass than about India playing a larger role in World War II. A lot of this changed in 1941 when Germany unilaterally broke their non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and attacked the Soviets. Suddenly, the Soviet Union was an ally. By that time, the Coast Defense Flights had been amalgamated into Indian Air Force, and 1 squadron had become 3 squadrons. Number 2 squadron and number 3 squadron were formed largely by taking on the aircraft and personnel of the 5 Coast Defense Flights. So after taking 7 years to grow to to grow from one flight to one squadron, the Indian Air Force essentially grew to 3 squadrons in 1 year, although only by amalgamating the coast defense flights. In addition, in 1940, the Indian Air Force sent 25 young Indians to the UK. These were all Indians who were qualified pilots. One of them was in fact Manmohan Singh, who I mentioned earlier, who had been one of the 3 participants in that air race, which had been won by Aspi engineer. So they went to the UK and started undertaking military flying and operational training, and they carried out 1 or 2 tours with RAF squadrons. Out of those 24, 7 were killed in accidents or in action during that training period or during their tours of operation with RAF squadrons. One of them, Manmohan Singh, was actually killed a year or so later flying out of Australia, was killed in action during a Japanese air raid. The remaining 16, to different degrees, carried out their tours of operation with Royal Air Force squadrons, found their way back to India. Some of them flew for a few months in the Middle East on their way back to India. Some of them distinguished themselves particularly, and it's notable that out of those 16 who survived, around 7 became Air Vice Marshals or Air Marshals in the post-independence Indian Air Force. So they were a pretty good batch. They were only the first batch of 3. When they came back to India, most of them came back to India in around late 1941 or early 1942. Right? Now in late 1941, something happened which completely transformed World War II and made it into a truly global war. And that was the Japanese attack on the United States at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, on the United States at Pearl Harbor, transformed the war from a Europe-centric war to a truly global war. And it also brought the war far closer to India. Because Japan, after attacking Pearl Harbor, set about attacking European colonies throughout East Asia. Japan had already been at war with China for several years at this point, and it proceeded to take over Dutch and British colonies throughout East Asia. It took over Java, which is now part of Indonesia. It took over Malaya, which is now Malaysia, was a British colony, captured Singapore, right? Allied with Siam, which is now Thailand, and got to Burma, the borders of Burma, by the end of 1941. So in early 1942, the Japanese were actually on the borders of Burma, which was administered at that time pretty much as a part of India. And so in early 1942, number 1 squadron of the Indian Air Force was sent out to Burma to join the British in the defense of Burma as the Japanese came closer and closer and closer. That campaign is now known as the First Burma Campaign, because there was a much bigger Burma campaign later. That First Burma Campaign was an unmitigated disaster for the Allies. The Japanese came sweeping in across the Siamese border, which is now the border between Burma and Thailand, and they rolled up the British in front of them. And they fell back in complete disarray and finally had to abandon Rangoon. But amidst that disaster, amidst all those retreats, one unit which stood out for its spirit, for its flexibility, for its enterprise, even in defeat, even while everything around them was falling apart, was number 1 Squadron, Indian Air Force. Number 1 Squadron, Indian Air Force had gone into Burma with a class of aircraft called Lysanders. Lysanders were Army cooperation aircraft, which is the role that the Indian Air Force was primarily trained for. They were intended to do reconnaissance, artillery spotting, message dropping, and roles of that kind in support of the army. When they got to Burma, it became very clear that there was very little possibility of doing close air support of the kind that they had been trained in, because the jungle didn't lend itself to that kind of work. But they could do long-range reconnaissance, and they could do a certain amount of bombing. Lysanders are not designed as bombers, but they can carry a couple of bombs under their undercarriage, adjacent to their wheels. And the commanding officer of No. 1 Squadron Indian Air Force at that time was a particularly energetic and swashbuckling officer by the name of Karun Krishna Majumdar, universally known as Jumbo Majumdar, big built and therefore nicknamed Jumbo. Right? Jumbo led No. 1 Squadron with tremendous spirit. Right? While everything around them was falling apart, No. 1 Squadron was throwing offensive punches back at the Japanese. Jumbo was taking his squadron and dropping bombs on the Japanese, and contemporary memoirs suggest that they were making parties out of it. They were treating it as a huge sport. They used to dive on the Japanese in the way that German Stukas, which are designed as dive bombers, used to dive in the European theaters. Stukas used to be fitted with sirens so that they emitted a frightening sound as they dived on their opponents. Lysanders had no such fittings, but what they did was to take empty beer bottles and throw them out as they dived, and the falling beer bottles emitted a whistling sound, which became No. 1 Squadron's trademark. So No. 1 Squadron, for a month in Burma, showed a degree of spirit and fight. They finally had to withdraw under orders. And even the withdrawal, they showed a lot of spirit and fighting capability. They commandeered 5 trucks and drove them 400 miles through the jungles back into India. Most people who abandoned Burma had to walk through those jungles on foot, and hundreds of thousands of them fell ill, or many of them died during that walk back from Burma into eastern India. A small item of trivia is one of the Anglo-Burmese families that made that horrendous trek from Burma into India for safety in early 1942 was the family of the Bollywood actress Helen, who's actually an Anglo-Burmese by birth. And she was 5 years old, and she survived that trek through the jungles from Burma into India, went on to settle in India, and as we all know, made a career for herself in Bollywood.